June 8th, I'm Tyler Remchuk, Zach Lang, Nation Dan, Josh Park. The regular cast of characters is here. We are live on Twitch, we are live on Twitter, live on YouTube, live on Facebook. If you're like our friend at DangleDump94, you're watching on all of them at one time. Thanks for tuning in. We got a bunch of stuff we're going to get to today. A little bit of Oilers talk, but first we're going to go through some of the big storylines from around the Stanley Cup playoffs. The first one being that the Winnipeg Jets have been swept. There was a stat out there, and now I don't remember it, of how many teams in NHL history have had their playoff runs ended in exactly 8 games, because the Jets go from sweep to swept. My question is, since this is an Oilers show, does that make you feel better about the Oilers getting swept by Winnipeg, that they got swept by Montreal, or somehow worse, or do you not care, Nation Dan?
For me, I think it's a little bit of confirmation that the Jets played out of their minds against us, and so you kind of take that as a lump for you. I'd love to have seen them put up a little bit more effort against the Canadians. I don't know if the Canadians are necessarily as good as they looked in that series, but for me, it also feels a little bit like when we got dominated by the Leafs mid-season. And then the Leafs went on to lose 7 of their next 9 games against far lesser competition than us. And so, teams get up for big series. They get up for big opponents, and they had a letdown afterwards.
Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm kind of split on it, because you watch that and you're like, okay, like realistically, if the Oilers would have got past the Jets, how would have they fared against the Habs? Because I think that a lot of people, going into this first round of the North Division playoffs, people were saying, it doesn't really matter who wins between the Oilers and the Jets. They're likely going to lose to the Leafs anyways. And then all of a sudden the Habs make it to the second round, and you're like, okay, and the Oilers probably would have fared okay against the Habs. I know that's easy to say considering they just got swept by the Jets, who just got swept by the Habs, so who knows what happened. But at the same time, you're like, okay, this is probably realistically a pretty easy cakewalk to what would have been the Final Four for the Edmonton Oilers, and then they end up getting swept in the first round. So it doesn't make me feel better. I don't really know. I hate both the Habs and the Jets, but yeah, I'm just happy the Leafs are out. So yeah, it's all good. I don't really care.
I picked the Habs to win the first round series, mainly because I thought it'd be the easier opponent for the Oilers, and I was trying to wish it into existence. But I did pick the Jets to beat the Habs in the next series, so I was wrong on that front. Zach, are you how stunned are you that the Habs were able to win and sweep this series?
How can you not laugh at it? I don't know another way to react. It's hilarious to me. I mean, it's such a typical hockey sort of story to have, Winnipeg go on this run, sweep the Oilers in the first round, and then completely fall on their face in the second round against a Montreal team that, they were favored to beat. Obviously it doesn't help that Mark Scheifele gets, the 4-game suspension, which is a whole other story. Game 1, that's a huge piece to lose for Winnipeg. So I'm not necessarily surprised that they got swept, but and I don't know if it makes me feel any better about the Oilers situation either, because I think there's been a fair share of people who have said, oh yeah, just confirmation bias that the Oilers are a terrible team, which we all know that they're not. But those things started running around out there already, so I don't really know what to say about it. It's kind of hilarious to me.
There was nothing more frustrating than watching Connor Hellebuck have bad games in that series against Montreal. He didn't have a lot of them, but fuck me, the guy stands on his head for overtime period after overtime period, then gives up the first OT shot the Habs throw his way in game 4. It was just kind of we couldn't get that bounce in game 2 or whatever, man. You couldn't give us that. No? Okay. That was the frustrating part, but the playoffs keep rolling on. We're going to get to some Oilers talk right away, so if you got questions, hit us up, whether it's in the Twitter chat or the Twitch chat. I'll be monitoring those two very closely. The other series that had some headlines made today, Bruins coach Bruce Cassidy fined $25,000 for hating on the officials, or whatever the fuck he did. But my take on that is he didn't actually say anything that bad. He just said the officials didn't have a great game. He added in there at one point that, these are the officials in the second round of the playoffs for a reason. These guys are good at their jobs. He just didn't like the reputation the Islanders had. I didn't see anything wrong with what Cassidy said. This is just the NHL going way overboard in protecting their officials. Does anyone else have a different take than that?
Well, not really. I mean, you look even in the first round, I'm surprised that Rod Brindamore didn't get fined a couple of times.
Yeah.
Like, Brindamore was way more critical of the referees in their series against Nashville than anything Cassidy said last night. It's the typical hypocritical NHL, right? They grant they grant media the ability to interview coaches and players afterwards, but it's almost like the NHL is forcing them to be muzzled in a sense, because when you have a coach like Bruce Cassidy come out and truly speak his mind about what was going on in the game, they were punishing him for it. So it's a really weird double-edged sword to me, especially as somebody who's been in those interviews with coaches before. Yeah. It's difficult, especially as a journalist, to try and get the cleanest, clearest answers and really how the coaches actually feel. And then when they tell you how they actually feel, the NHL finds them. So I think it's a little bit of a joke.
I have this was from my time not covering the NHL, but covering a junior league, where I went into a press conference with a coach after the game. And it was only me and a couple other reporters. So he comes in, the door closes, and he goes, "Are you guys recording?" And we're all like, no. And he goes, "All right, good." And he fucking ripped everything. How bad his team is, how bad the officials were. The crowd wasn't in it. And he went off. It was hilarious. And then when it came time to turn on our recorders and get a soundbite, he goes, "Yeah, I liked our effort tonight. You got to earn your calls. They took the crowd out of it early, and that's a compliment to them." And it was just like cliche after cliche. And I'm sitting there the whole time being like, holy shit, this is not what you think at all. And like in the case of Cassidy, like he just came out and was honest. And it's not like he went out of his way to be like, the NHL is screwing us, the officials are screwing us, this is a conspiracy, blah, 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 blah. He just like said his piece. That's why I didn't have a problem with it. He didn't like unfairly target anyone.
Yeah, the one thing that I think maybe could be a part of it as well is the fact that he brought the Islanders into it. If he would have been strictly critical of the officiating in itself, then maybe the NHL would have given him a little bit of a pass considering what we saw out of Brindamore. But I think maybe it's because he drew the Islanders into it and kind of was criticizing them in itself, which also doesn't really make sense either, because why would you fine a guy for doing that either? But the one thing I did take out of that clip from Cassidy was the New York Saints would actually be a sick team name. Like that sounded good. I liked the way it sounded. They probably have sick unis. So if the Islanders ever want to change their name, go to the Saints. That would sound cool.
Looking here at the chat, Spanky Egg, honesty equals fines. And that's really what I'm taking out of this, is that if you're a coach and you want to save yourself $25,000, you just keep it shut, deliver 12 cliches in your press conference, and you will be good to go.
Yeah, pretty much.
And for me, in hockey, we have a sport where we always talk about we want to see these players' personalities. You don't want the robotic answers. And Tyler gives a perfect example of something where you maybe wouldn't have got the unfiltered version that Tyler got, but that coach would have been honest about his feelings more so if he didn't feel like it was going to be turned into this shit show of a storyline that and I'm not saying that Tyler does that necessarily either, but like these players get blasted if they attack the media. Yeah. They get blasted if they attack their own teammates. They get blasted if they attack the referees. So what are they allowed to talk about at this point? Themselves? And then, like you said, platitudes and nonsense that gives you no information, no real insight from the media. And then the players get upset at the media when the media is just trying to use them to fill in a line in their article that they've already written, kind of story. So it's this self-fulfilling prophecy that just keeps putting us into the hamster wheel, and then we're left asking, well, what are we really doing after these games anyways?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great point as well. Like, I don't know. It is frustrating from like a media perspective as well to like have that taken out of it. And the NHL needs to grow the game. But if you just sit there and muzzle everyone who has a microphone in front of their face, like that's not helping anyone in this instance. And like the Cassidy thing, that's like a good clip. That's a good headline. That adds fuel to the fire going forward. Like there's nothing really that bad about any of that, but whatever.
Well, and why don't we let the referees talk? Like, why are the referees such a fragile institution that they can't speak to their calls or their missed calls and say, you know what, listen, Bruce, like I let this go and I let that go and I saw this and I didn't like that. Like that kind of information at least gives the referees the ability to speak back to it. And instead of this system, we're actually having a little bit of character and a little bit of personality built up, that then if it gets outrageous and you've got Francis Chiron attacking Bruce Cassidy's character and the Bruins character, that kind of thing, then maybe you have a reel it in moment. But instead, we're just in this fine culture where everybody's going to give it 110% and take pucks deep and keep going hard into the boards. Like, it's just goofy.
I'm kind of split on that concept of making the referees talk post game, because I think it would add a level of accountability, you know, and I think it would also add a level of, you know, insight. When you're a fan and you see certain things happen in the game and you just want an insider's perspective at it, I think it would be kind of cool. But at the same time, I just really don't know what the added benefit would be out of that. You know what I mean? And it's a level of like, okay, if you're a referee and you're realistically getting into this profession, like, if you go to the podium as a referee, there's never going to be a pat on the back. There's never going to be a, you know, we played well tonight. There's never going to be a, hey, you know, we had a good game tonight. The referees never get praised. It's criticism 100% of the time. And I think that that's when, you know, them doing media kind of comes into play, because of the sense that, you know, that it's never going to be, and I know that's not their job, is to get praised for what they do, because if they do their job right, no one's talking about them. It's like a stay-at-home defenseman. You know what I mean? But at the same time, like, just really what would come out of it other than the fact that they would just get berated every single time they did media? You know what I mean? And you're not going to break down individual plays because of the, you can't look at a play and be like, okay, you know, why'd you not call a trip here? Because it's the speed of the game. What is the referee going to say? Oh, I didn't see it. Oh, I don't know. I just decided not to. Like realistically, fair. If you're a referee and someone asks you, oh, why didn't you call a trip here? Are you just going to be like, oh, well, I didn't see it. I missed the play. I just didn't want to call a trip. I was game managing. You know, there's nothing good that would come out of that for a referee. Zero.
What if they did something that was like the NBA 2-minute report or whatever, right? That's something I can maybe get behind a little bit more, because I think you raised some good points there, Josh. Like, you know, is it just unnecessary stress on a referee to have to sit there and be like coming up with an excuse for why the high sticking call wasn't called, and blah, 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 blah. Like, it's an interesting debate, though. Give us your take on Twitch or Twitter, where I'm looking at some Oilers questions that we are going to get to in just a second here. Got a couple piled up. But first, expansion draft talk for the Edmonton Oilers. Daniel Nugent-Bowman over at The Athletic wrote an interesting piece today about what the Oilers' plan could be. And the big takeaway from it is that he alluded pretty heavily to the fact that Caleb Jones could be unprotected here. Both he and William Lagesson could be available for Seattle to take in the expansion draft. Zach, I know you're going to have a strong take on this, so I'll let you go first. Is that a huge mistake by the Oilers if they let Jones go for nothing?
No, I don't think so. I think it's probably your best case scenario if Caleb Jones gets lost in the expansion draft. Look, he struggled to stay in the lineup all year. He seemed to fall out of favor with the coaching staff a little bit at times. And then when the playoffs roll around, Caleb Jones wasn't even on the ice, which was a confusing situation to me nonetheless. I think at the end of the day, there's more valuable assets that the Oilers have. I'd much rather lose Caleb Jones than I would Ethan Bear. I think Ethan Bear's got a bit of a higher ceiling, and I think he's a better player right now. And he's got the trust of the coaching staff, and I think that's a big difference between the two there. You know, I don't project Caleb Jones or William Lagesson to be top pairing defensemen in the NHL. You know, they're probably a bottom pairing guy or maybe a second pairing guy at best in their career. So I think as far as that goes, it probably could be the best case scenario for the Oilers. And they might be able to maneuver that with some James Neal trade or a Mikko Koskinen trade and get them over to Seattle as well. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with it, though.
Yeah, I'm not heartbroken at the fact that you might lose Caleb Jones for nothing in the expansion draft. I think he's got upside. You know, every young player to a certain extent has upside, but he certainly has top 4 potential. And I don't love the idea of losing it for free, but I'm not losing any sleep over it. The one thing that'll really be a test of his value to me is if they can trade him to another team, right? Like, if there is a move out there where Arizona, for instance, goes, you know what, we got Aiden Hill, we wouldn't mind taking Koskinen off your hands for a year if you give us a young defenseman like Caleb Jones who's cost efficient for another season too, right? Like, maybe there's some sort of move there, or straight up trading him for a forward with another team who like has a forward they're going to lose an expansion but could keep Caleb Jones, and you swap him. It'll be interesting. Josh, are you at all upset about the idea of potentially losing Caleb Jones?
Yeah, no, not really. Zach kind of touched on it perfectly. He struggled to stay in the lineup during the playoffs. We've seen flashes out of Caleb Jones, especially last season. I would date back to where all of a sudden, you see his game and you wonder, what is the ceiling for this guy? Could he realistically be a top four defenseman on the Oilers in the years to come? But then you also kind of have to look down the pipeline and see some of the other guys that are coming up as well. Evan Bouchard likely going to be a regular in this lineup next year. I know he plays on the right side, but then you also look at Philip Broberg. What role is he going to play in the next 2 years for the Edmonton Oilers? And, you wonder if Caleb Jones, it's not necessarily a matter of him not having the talent to be in this lineup. It's maybe more so just, there's just other pieces that are ahead of you on the depth chart. So, if the Oilers end up losing him, ideal situation, no. Are there people in oil country that are probably a little bit higher up on him than I am? Sure. But I also at the same time, think that, what happens with guys like, Tyler Benson? Like, does he have to get protected?
Yeah, Benson's getting protected, or he has to be.
So, oh man, out of those two, who would I rather get taken? It's tough because I haven't really seen much out of Tyler Benson in the time that he has played. I know he hasn't had much of an opportunity, but realistically, the foot speed's an issue. And have I seen anything out of Tyler Benson that makes me think that he's going to even be in the top 12 for this team in the next 2 years? No, probably not. So, who would I rather get taken? Tyler Benson or Caleb Jones? Probably Tyler Benson, because I think that Caleb Jones would probably be even more of a piece if you wanted to trade him away. But yeah, I don't know. If Caleb Jones gets taken, it's not the end of the world.
What do you think, Dan?
Well, I mean, for me, the positive that I take away from it is where this organization has come from the Vegas Golden Knights expansion draft to now. We gave up Griffin Reinhardt in the last expansion draft, and I would argue that the free agent signing of Brad Hunt was more impactful for the Vegas Golden Knights that year. So for us to be worried about losing to Caleb Jones, every team is going to lose a player that is of quality. I say that with every expansion draft. That's what they're designed to do, is give Seattle a good base to build their franchise off of. So, yeah, I mean, if you lose Caleb Jones, it's not a roster player, which is a positive, but it's also a player that could fill a spot as the season rolls along. And you guys know I'm a big defensive depth guy. Mm-hmm. So I like to have that defensive depth, but we have to give up a good player. And so if it has to be Jones, it has to be Jones.
Looking at the text or the inbox here, Canadian Barbarian 98. The obvious answer is going 4-4-1 if Klefbom is back and have handshake deals with Larson and Nuge. If Klefbom is done, then you go 7-3-1, protecting Jones, Bear, and Nurse. And that's interesting as well. Nugent Bowman wrote about the idea of the Adam Larson extension potentially being done beforehand. That's interesting because I think as an outsider and as just people who observe the moves of the team, you'd sit there and go, well, why would you sign Adam Larson? Like, he's an unrestricted free agent, have a handshake deal with him, blah, blah, blah. But there is a bit of a risk here that, like, if Seattle said, because they get apparently a 48-hour window to negotiate with free agents during the expansion draft. If Seattle went to Larson and you gave them that opportunity and they went, hey, we're going to take you and we're going to offer you $4.6 million a season for 4 years. Larson might sit there and go, I love being an Oiler. I know they're not going any higher than 4 because that was our handshake deal. But all of a sudden, he could change his mind. Like, there is more risk to that, I think, than maybe some of us here in the media and as fans maybe understand. Like, Seattle could take him and they could sign him if they wanted to. It'd be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it could be worse too. Like, I mean, I don't hate Adam Larson. I like him as a player, but if Seattle's offering him, $4.6 or $5 million a year. You got to let him walk, right? Yeah. And then you still hold on to a guy like a Caleb Jones or a William Legason who can eat into some of those minutes there, right? Like, if the Oilers are going to get priced out by Seattle on Adam Larson, I'm not going to be making big moves to try and retain Larson at that point.
Could probably replace him. Yeah, that's a good point. He's a guy who there are a couple other Adam Larson types out in free agency, but all the tea leaves are saying he's going to get signed for 3-4 years, $4 million, whatever it ends up being. Here's a big one. S. Simons, 94. Protect Jones so his brother comes to Edmonton. We also had a message in here from Dangled Up 94. Is Seth Jones a realistic target? Bodog has the Flyers and Oilers as the favorites to land him. And those are actually the two teams Chris Johnston mentioned on the DFO rundown last week, were the Flyers and Oilers. He adds, if so, is Bear this year's first and a prospect enough to do that? My take on this, and we really argued about this on Oilers Nation Radio, Dan. That's a luxury item for me, going out and getting Seth Jones or Dougie Hamilton. You clearly have a need to improve your depth scoring. Your blue line was good last year. If you bring back a lot of the same pieces, it shouldn't be an issue per se. I don't want to go give up huge assets for a guy like Seth Jones, who is then going to need probably an $8 million extension next offseason, and a guy who might not even want to sign in Edmonton either. And I don't think keeping his brother around is necessarily going to change that. Dan, I know your take on it, so I shall save you for last. But I'll go with Josh first here. What do you think? You like Jones?
Nope, don't want him. He's got 1 year left on a $5.4 million deal. You know, you're going to give up huge assets going across in the other direction. And once you get him on this team, realistically, if you want to keep him after that year, you're signing him to a big ticket. He's one of those guys that, you know, he's a great defenseman. Don't get me wrong. He would really add depth to that back end. But I look at a guy like Seth Jones and I think, okay, the difference between Seth Jones and Adam Larson, the difference in skill and the difference in what they would bring to the back end, is that enough for how much of a difference it would be in dollar? Is that worth that $4 million extra dollars that you would have to spend on Seth Jones that you could use to add a depth piece in your top nine? So I think it's really evident that the Oilers are missing pieces in their top six. Realistically, you got to add another scoring winger or a scoring forward. I think that's a way bigger issue for this team. And frankly, like you said, Tyler, I think the luxury item of adding Seth Jones isn't really the payoff of what you're going to get in return, because is that the issue that's kind of leaving the Oilers without getting over the hump? No, I don't think Seth Jones is the answer in that way. Yeah, it'd be great, but like, you're going to have to give him such a big contract after next year, and I just really don't think it would be worth it.
Zach?
Yeah, I'm not sold on it either. I mean, I like the player. I like his size. I like the skill set that he has. But you know what? His underlying numbers are really not great with Columbus. And there's a good argument to be made that he's actually been propped up over the last 3 years by his partner, Zach Werenski. So, you know, Jones's numbers away from him aren't that great. Even with them, they aren't that great. I'm not sure if Jones is a type of needle pusher that would really push the Oilers over the top in that sense. I think you get more value out of Ethan Bear on solely from the perspective of not only contract value, but also what he's actually producing on the ice. And the underlying numbers say that Ethan Bear is a much better defenseman than that of Seth Jones. So cost of acquisition, cost to resign, everything, you know, coming to, I'm not sure if I'm a fan of that.
Dan?
Am I allowed to talk now, Tyler?
Well, you make your case now. Yeah, I didn't know what the other two were going to say. I knew you were going to be opposite me. So.
Yeah, and so for me, it's the argument that we had on Oilers Nation Radio was more talking, for me at least, about Dougie Hamilton.
Okay.
But so my thoughts on Seth Jones are, again, you know, it's a restricted move in the sense that, like, why does the package have to be that big for Columbus? Because I don't know if there's that many teams that are able to bring in that kind of money, and everybody knows that he doesn't want to be there anymore, and so they're dealing from a position of weakness. So if the cost of acquisition is lower, and I think that that's kind of what everybody's feeling like, is that the cost of acquisition would be too high. If the cost of acquisition is lower, then you always have to add better defensemen to a team.
Yeah.
And this team, like, when I look at these teams that are now left in the playoffs, and again, you don't build your franchise off of what you've seen successful in the moment, but over the last 10 years, who has won the Stanley Cup playing fire wagon hockey? Not many teams.
No.
Most teams are built top and bottom well. And the Edmonton Oilers are not. The Toronto Maple Leafs are not. And, you know, we saw the results of that in these last two series. And then even into this series, you know, the Montreal Canadiens were a more complete team than the Winnipeg Jets were. They also have one of the best goalies in the playoffs. But that's another story for the offseason for us. But, yeah, to me, if you can bring in better defense, you make your team better defensively, the team doesn't have to play afraid like Ethan Bear did, say that they were playing against the Winnipeg Jets, and it's a different outcome in my humble opinion.
An interesting name here. Iron Blizzard threw out the idea, said I'd rather have Savard or Alexiak. Alexiak is a lefty. He's going to be a UFA. The idea of bringing him here, because I don't think he costs, I think he's Adam Larson range likely on the UFA market. Does that not sound like the perfect partner for Evan Bouchard on the third pairing? like a bigger stay-at-home guy. He's not a terrible puck mover by any means, but I look at a big, intense defenseman like Alexiak on the left side with Bouchard on the right. I think that if you were to get Alexiak and you start with those two on your third pairing, I think that's probably your second pairing and probably a heavily used second pairing. I'm a fan of going the free agent route with the defensive side of things because, one, I think they need to focus their future assets on trying to improve the forward group. And two, there are some good defensemen out there. Like even Alec Martinez is a guy who's going to be a UFA. He's older, granted, but there's options out there. Is there anyone out there on the defensive market that stands out for you, Zach?
I like Alexiak a lot, actually. I mean, I think I would almost rather have him versus Adam Larson. Alexiak is a bit bigger. He has a little bit of that puck moving ability that I think Larson doesn't quite have. And on top of that, his underlying numbers have been really strong too. He's a really, really good penalty killer as well. And I think the advantage that somebody like Alexiak would have over Larson on the Oilers next year is that Alexiak's a left shot, right? Yeah. And as you mentioned, he would be able to slide in on the third pairing with Evan Bouchard, help ease Bouchard into the NHL a little bit, even though I don't really think he needs to be eased in. I think he's that good right now. I would rather have Jamie Alexiak than Adam Larson for that reason.
You said Alexiak's a little bit bigger than Larson. You were being very generous to Larson. It's 4 inches and 50 pounds.
Josh, anyone out there you got your eye on, or are you just going to see how it happens, see how it unfolds?
I'm looking at the defenseman free agent numbers right now, or the players. I have a list of them pulled up to me right here. None of the names are really sticking out, but Alexiak, I don't mind Alexiak. I agree with you, Tyler, that you'd like to go the free agent route because you're not giving up assets in return. But, I wonder what, and Dan, similar to what you were saying, I wonder what the acquisition cost would be. I should circle back and say, Dan, I do agree with you when it comes to the Seth Jones point in the sense that, if your acquisition cost to get Seth Jones in return isn't that high, then sure, 5-4 for Seth Jones, that's a pretty good piece in your top 4 for not a big contract. That's not going to swallow up a ton of money, and that's going to allow you a lot of freedom still to probably fill in one more piece on that back end and then give you a lot of money to spend up front. If you're sending a lot in return, no, I would stay away from it because then if you're giving up a lot for a guy like Seth Jones, you're kind of expecting that you're going to re-sign him following the expiration of his contract, and then you're like, okay, well, that's a lot of money that's going to get swallowed up as well. But UFA numbers or UFA guys that I'm looking at, none of them really stick out. But yeah, Alexiak, it's never an issue having big bodies on the back end. It's a smaller, faster league than it's ever been before, but I still think the value of having big guys in the back end that can kind of dominate in their own zone is super beneficial. So yeah, Alexiak paired with a guy like Evan Bouchard, I think that would be a dynamite combo.
Dream blue line next year, keeping it, semi-realistic. For me, it would be Nurse Bear as a top pair, and your bottom 2 pairings in whatever order: Alexiak, Bouchard, Cuckoo, Larson, with whether it's Russell, Lagesson, or Jones sitting as your 7th defenseman. Either one of them I'm cool with.
No, Tyler, you forgot about Tyson Barrie in there.
He's going to be a great Seattle Kraken.
Tyson Barrie.
Sorry, I've never heard of this man before.
We spent a lot of time talking about defensemen today, so we'll probably save the forward talk for next week as we dig into that. But I will say this, Josh Park, beautiful job on the Zach Hyman Photoshop. Has me dreaming.
Yes, sir.
Guys, I got one quick question if we still got a couple of minutes here, Tyler. Tomorrow is an important day for the Edmonton Oilers and Oilers fans as the Norris nominees get revealed. Do you guys think that Darnell Nurse is going to be one of the top 3 finalists?
My heart says yes, but my mind says no. I think he'll finish top 5.
I think that they talked, I can't remember what podcast I was listening to, they were talking about where the voters lay in this system, and I think that it is heavily weighted towards the North Division. That said, I don't think that Nurse will end up in the top 3. I think when we look at the votes afterwards, where they show everybody and who they voted for, I think we'll be pleasantly surprised about the number of people that did vote for Darnell. I just don't know if he has enough to break that top 3 between. Well, who do you think it's going to be?
Hedman will get a lot of love
in the conversation. Yeah,
Adam Fox will get a lot of love, and I think Cale Makar will get a lot of love.
I was going to say Makar. I think he'll be.
Yeah.
So I think you might be able to make an argument for Nurse, but yeah, you're right. I think it's tough. What do you think, Zach? You think he's getting in there?
I don't know. It's hard. I think he's right on the cusp. I think he's like a 3-4. Like those are the other guys I would have in there, Tyler, too. Hedman, Makar, Fox, right? I think Nurse probably edges out Adam Fox. But Makar and Hedman, those are a tough 1-2 up there that he has to go up against. I think he could get in though. I do.
And Tyson Barrie probably took away some of his numbers too.
I don't know who this Tyson Barrie is guy that you guys keep talking about here.
Well, we should wonder. I think Tyson Barrie will finish top 6 for sure. It's got to be top 6.
I'm looking at I
might release mine.
I'm looking at some of the numbers here in favor of Darnell Nurse, and he actually averaged more time on ice than Fox, Makar, and Hedman. He had more even strength points than Fox, Makar, and Hedman. I know plus minus isn't, a great stat by any means, but Darnell Nurse did also have a better plus minus than Fox, Makar, and Hedman. He was clearly the number one defenseman on his team. He was relied upon a lot. There's a real interesting case for him. The other, you talked about the heavy North Division bias. I wonder with some of these awards, so the writers are going to sit there and they'll be like, all right, Connor McDavid's winning the Hart, pencil him in. I can't give the Norris to another guy in the North Division. I don't want to show my bias. So I feel like writers might almost in a weird way, or the Canadian writers might talk themselves out of Darnell Nurse to show that they were watching the other divisions. Cale Makar was great. Victor Hedman, he's always good. Yeah, write him in there. Right? Adam Fox, yeah. I wonder if that could happen.
Well, and they have to give their
Adam
votes for the best
ton of votes.
Yeah.
Just because of that, Tyler. Yeah.
What'd you say, Dan?
I said, and they also have to think we're giving Mike Smith Vezina votes. So.
Oh yeah. Well, he didn't crack him. Adam Fox is a guy who doesn't get talked about a lot, north of the border. And in an episode of the DFO Rundown on Buy or Sell, I said, is Adam Fox one of the most underrated players in the league? And Frank Saravalli got mad at me. He was like, get rid of your North Division bias. He's not underrated. Everyone down here knows he's great. And I was like, okay, sorry, Frankie. It was funny. Fuck. Oh, shit. All right, okay.
You call him Frankie?
Frank is not putting up with that.
Mixing a little Frankie once in a while. I think that's what he used to go by. Anyways, we're off on a weird tangent. All right, thanks to everyone who tuned in on the Twitch chat. We had a lot of comments there, a lot of questions as well. If we didn't answer your question, I apologize. Fire it back in here next week, though. Next Tuesday, when we're back again with another edition of State of the Nation. For Josh Park, Zach Lang, Nation Dan, I'm Tyler Remchuk. Everyone enjoy your week. Boys,